The sun hung low over the desert plain, bleeding a dull amber light across the sweeping frontier, as if the day itself struggled to hold on just a bit longer. Heat shimmered above the baked earth, rising in wavering curtains that blurred the horizon and made every distant figure appear uncertain, half-born from dust and mirage. Yet nothing felt uncertain to Caleb Mercer as he rode along the narrow trail that curled between rocky ridges and parched sagebrush. He carried the tension of a man who had lived too long with regret and the resolve of someone who had finally decided he would no longer run from the past that hunted him. Caleb's horse snorted beneath him, hooves kicking up soft plumes of red dust while the leather of his saddle creaked with each shift of weight. His hat brim cast a long shadow across his sharp, sun-scarred features. Time had carved lines along his brow, and hardship had strengthened his jaw, but it was the quiet turbulence in his eyes that revealed the truth. Caleb had returned to a place that had once filled him with belonging, only to leave him marked by a wound deeper than flesh. He had fled years ago, carrying nothing but guilt and the memory of a night soaked in smoke and blood. Ahead lay Hollow Bend, a settlement small enough to miss if one blinked too long, but full of stories that clung stubbornly to the land. Wooden storefronts leaned into the wind. Dust swirled around a handful of wagons tied near the general store, and somewhere near the edge of town lived the one woman Caleb feared, facing more than any outlaw with a loaded rifle. She had been Charlotte Hale then, sharp-spirited, brave, unafraid to speak her mind, and Caleb had left her without offering so much as a reason she could hold on to. Now, as he paused at the crest overlooking Hollow Bend, he wondered if she would even recognize him. The years had shifted him into something harder, something quieter, something that carried the weight of choices he wished he could undo. But Charlotte had always seen through him in ways no one else could. If she looked into his eyes now, she would see everything he tried to bury. Caleb urged his horse forward, forcing his thoughts into the rhythm of each step. He told himself he had returned only because Hollow Bend needed help. Word had traveled across counties. Land thieves had begun circling the town like vultures, backed by gunmen and shielded by corrupt lawmen willing to sell justice for a handful of dollars. Farmers were losing claims. Ranchers were disappearing. And the few who dared speak up found their barns burned or their water lines poisoned. Someone Caleb trusted had sent word that if he ever intended to make right the wrongs he had done, now was the time. But Caleb knew the truth. His desire to protect this town was tangled with the unresolved ache he carried for Charlotte. He reached the first row of worn wooden buildings just as a wind gust spiraled through the street, scattering dust that stung his cheeks. A few townsfolk glanced his way. One man squinting suspiciously, a woman quickly ushering her child inside, an old-timer tilting his head as if measuring Caleb against distant memory. He dismounted slowly, hoping his sudden return would not stir trouble before he even set foot inside the saloon. The door creaked open with the familiar groan he remembered. Inside, the air was scented with whiskey, old smoke, and the murmur of tired voices. Lantern light flickered across faces etched with worry. Conversations dropped as he entered, leaving only the faint shuffle of cards and the clink of glass. Caleb didn't need the attention, but he accepted it. Strangers rarely arrived without reason in a place like this. Behind the counter stood Jonas Pike, the saloon keeper whose thick beard and broad shoulders made him appear as unshakable as the oak bar he leaned against. Jonas froze for a heartbeat before recognition dawned. "Well," Jonas said slowly, voice carrying enough weight to draw every ear, "if this ain't a spirit walked out of the past." Caleb removed his hat respectfully. "Good to see you too, Jonas." "That depends," Jonas replied, eyes narrowing. "You aim to bring more trouble with you, Mercer?" Caleb met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I came because trouble already arrived." Murmurs swept through the room like a breeze rustling dry grass. Jonas studied him another moment before exhaling a rough breath. "Then you came to the right place, and maybe too late. They've already tightened their grip. Folks are scared. Sheriff's hands are tied or paid off. And the Hale Ranch." Caleb felt his chest tighten. "Charlotte," Jonas hesitated, as though weighing how much Caleb deserved to know. She's strong. Always has been. But she can't fight a ring of hired guns alone. They want her land bad. A lot of folks are saying she's next on their list. A cold dread settled over Caleb like a shadow swallowing the last rays of daylight. He had imagined many reasons for returning, but none more pressing than this. Whatever had passed between him and Charlotte, whatever pain lingered, none of it mattered compared to the danger closing around her. He stepped closer to the counter. Where is she now? Home, Jonas answered, but she won't welcome you easy. You left her with nothing but questions. Caleb nodded, and I'll answer them. You better, Jonas said, or this town's last good heart might harden for good. Caleb turned to leave, but a sharp voice cut across the saloon. Mercer? A man rose from a poker table near the back, a tall figure with a coat draped loosely over his holster, eyes glinting beneath the low brim of his hat. Caleb didn't recognize him, but the man smiled with a confidence that set the room on edge. Heard your name once or twice, the stranger drawled. Funny timing you showing up now. Real funny. Caleb kept his posture calm, though every instinct sharpened. You got something to say? The stranger's smile widened. Only that hollow bend ain't as welcoming as it used to be. And some of us don't appreciate old ghosts stirring up dust. Caleb held the man's gaze. I'm not here for you. No, the stranger replied softly, but you will be. Caleb pushed through the saloon doors without another word, stepping back into the fading light. The sky deepened to a bruised purple, wind carrying the scent of approaching night. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets lay Charlotte's ranch, and with it the reckoning he had avoided for far too long. He placed a foot in the stirrup, swung into the saddle, and turned his horse toward the open road. The past waited ahead, not behind, and the night felt suddenly alive with the promise of conflict, redemption, and consequences that would not be easily escaped. Caleb nudged his horse forward, heart steadying with resolve. Whatever awaited him at the Hale Ranch, pain, forgiveness, or something far more dangerous, he intended to face it head-on, and the Wild West, with all its unforgiving laws and lonely miles, felt ready to test him once more. Elias rode beside Mara as twilight crept across the canyon, the world turning amber and dust-heavy, while the wind carried the scent of distant rain. They had followed the trail since dawn, pushing their horses hard, driven not by certainty, but by the stubborn hope that the men they pursued had made a mistake somewhere along the line. Every sign they uncovered, every faint mark in the dirt, seemed to confirm that the kidnappers had split from the main road to avoid attention, dragging with them the one person Elias could not afford to lose. Mara rode, with her shoulders squared, her gaze narrowed, refusing to let exhaustion claim even a fraction of her resolve. The silence between them was not empty. It throbbed with unspoken fear and the weight of the choices they would soon be forced to make. As they reached a bend near a cluster of boulders, Elias raised a hand, signaling Mara to slow. The tracks ahead grew clearer, sharper, and fresher, as if the men had recently stopped to rest. A dying campfire lay smoldering beside a patch of trampled grass, and discarded scraps of dried meat suggested a hurried meal. Elias knelt beside a set of hoof prints, brushing ash aside to uncover the faint outline of a boot heel. It was smaller than the others, delicate, and his breath caught in his chest. Mara dismounted and stood behind him, her shadow long against the fading light. She did not speak, yet Elias felt the tremble in her breath. It matched the shaking in his hands. Whoever had been dragged through here was alive, at least recently, and the captors were no more than a few hours ahead. The tension between Elias and Mara was not born of mistrust, but of history. Long before the raid that shattered their quiet homestead, they had shared years of companionship forged in hardship. Elias had once been a scout, a man who navigated the borderlands with a quiet confidence that others admired from afar. Mara, on the other hand, carried the spirit of a storm, restless, fierce, and unwilling to back down even when faced with overwhelming odds. Their bond had been steady, though not without friction, and the sudden abduction had reignited old embers of guilt and blame. Elias believed he should have anticipated the danger, while Mara blamed herself for letting her guard slip during a moment of unexpected calm. Neither voiced these thoughts, but they simmered beneath the urgency, pushing them forward. They continued deeper into the canyon, the walls narrowing and the shadows growing longer. The moon climbed the darkening sky, casting pale light across the jagged terrain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, its voice echoing off the rocks like a warning. Elias tightened his grip on the reins. "We're close," he murmured, his voice dry. Mara nodded but said nothing. She guided her horse along the narrowest edge of the path, her posture rigid, her focus unbroken. The strain of the journey weighed heavily on both of them, yet neither showed signs of surrender. Every mile carried the chance of danger, and every silence carried the promise of confrontation. As midnight approached, they discovered another camp, the remnants of one, at least. Ashes still warm, footprints scattered, a torn scrap of fabric tangled in a thorn bush. Elias lifted the fabric, recognizing it instantly. A wave of dread washed over him, dark and potent. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "It's hers." The words cracked like brittle glass. The reality of it struck them simultaneously. The captors were forcing their prisoner through harsh terrain at a brutal pace, and desperation suggested they feared pursuit. That fear could make them reckless. Recklessness could turn fatal. Elias folded the cloth and tucked it into his coat. Mara watched him with eyes that glimmered with both fury and anguish. They rode on until the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. The landscape shifted from canyon to open plain, where the grass rolled in gentle waves beneath the early light. Somewhere ahead, beyond the low ridge, smoke rose in a thin column. Mara spotted it first. She nudged her horse forward, but Elias grabbed her reins, stopping her. "They might have set a trap," he warned. "If they know we're following, they'll expect us to rush in blind." Mara's jaw tightened. "We don't have the time to circle wide." Elias hesitated, torn between caution and urgency. He knew she was right. Every minute lost was an invitation for tragedy. They approached the ridge on foot, leading their horses behind them to silence their steps. The grass brushed their legs, cool with morning dew. When they reached the crest, the sight below them hardened their breaths. A small camp stood in a shallow basin. 3 horses tied to a fallen log, 2 men milling near a pot suspended over a fire, and a third man sitting near what looked like a wooden crate. But it was not a crate. It was a cage of crude timber and rope, barely large enough to hold a person. Mara's hands curled into fists. Elias put a hand on her arm, though it felt like trying to restrain a wildfire. "We need a plan," he whispered. "If we go down there swinging, someone could get hurt." "Someone already is," she countered, her voice low but steady. They watched the camp for several minutes, studying patterns, listening for cues. The men were armed but distracted, arguing about the best route east. One wandered toward the horses, another stepped into the brush to relieve himself. The third man poked irritably at the cage with a stick, muttering indistinctly. Elias's pulse thundered. Mara shifted beside him, ready to strike. The moment felt balanced on a razor's edge. Elias drew a slow breath. "When we move fast." Mara nodded, her eyes fixed on the cage, and together, without another word, they stepped forward into the basin, ready to face whatever waited in the shadows of the rising sun. The air trembled with tension as hope and danger collided in a single heartbeat there. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge as Elias and Mara descended toward the camp, their steps measured, their breaths steady despite the storm raging inside them. Every instinct urged them to charge headlong into danger, but the weight of what waited below forced them to move with deliberate caution. Elias kept his revolver low and ready, his gaze locked on the man nearest the fire. Mara moved beside him with the poise of a seasoned hunter, her fingers wrapped around the haft of her knife. The faint clatter of a pot over the flames masked their advance until Elias reached the basin floor. Then the wind shifted, carrying the scent of horses and smoke, and one of the kidnappers lifted his head. He barely had time to shout before Elias fired. The shot punched through the morning stillness, sending crows scattering from the nearby trees. Mara was already sprinting forward, striking the second man before he could draw his weapon. The third man, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, lunged for the cage, snarling like an animal cornered. Elias recognized him instantly. Harlan Briggs, a mercenary with a reputation steeped in cruelty. Harlan's hand clamped over the latch, and for a moment Elias feared he might kill the prisoner out of spite. But Mara reached him first, driving her shoulder into his ribs. They toppled to the ground, rolling across the dirt in a violent tangle of limbs. Elias rushed to the cage. Inside, pale and trembling but alive, was Lena, her wrists raw from rope, her eyes wide with terror and relief. "It's all right," Elias breathed, forcing calm into his voice. "We've got you now." He cut the knots with quick, precise strokes, helping her into his arms as she collapsed against him. The gratitude in her eyes struck him deeper than any wound he had taken along the frontier. Every mile of fear, every moment of doubt, suddenly felt worth it. Lena managed a weak smile, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew you'd come." Behind him, Harlan roared as he broke free of Mara's grip and staggered to his feet. Blood streaked his cheek, and his expression twisted with fury. He drew his revolver with a shaking hand and fired wildly. Elias shielded Lena with his body and dove behind a fallen log. Mara ducked behind a boulder as splinters erupted around them. Harlan steadied his aim, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You should have stayed gone, Mercer. You ain't walking out of here." The name landed like a stone in Elias's chest. Someone had paid Harlan not just for Lena, but for revenge. A revenge rooted in Elias's shadowed past. Elias rose from cover, firing 2 shots that forced Harlan to retreat behind a dead tree. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder as echoes bounced across the basin. Mara circled wide, slipping between rocks with silent precision. Elias understood her plan immediately: push Harlan into the open. He just needed to hold the outlaw's attention long enough. "You always were a coward, Briggs," Elias called, hiding behind coin and bigger guns. Harlan barked a harsh laugh. "Takes a coward to know one. Heard what you did. Heard who paid the price." The words hit Elias harder than the bullets tearing past him. The past he had tried to bury clawed its way upward, threatening to drag him under. But Lena's soft sob behind him snapped everything into focus. Whatever sins he carried, whatever ghosts whispered in the dark, he would not fail the ones who trusted him, not again. Elias rose, stepping into the open with calm resolve. Harlan fired once more, the bullet grazing Elias's sleeve. Before he could take a second shot, Mara struck from behind, slamming her knife hilt into the base of his skull. Harlan staggered, cursed, and swung at her wildly. Elias rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. The impact sent both men sprawling, fists flying. Harlan fought with savage desperation, his blows fueled by rage and wounded pride. But Elias fought with something deeper: purpose, responsibility, and the fierce determination to protect. At last, Elias seized Harlan's arm and wrenched the gun free, hurling it across the dirt. He pressed the outlaw to the ground, breathing hard. Harlan thrashed once more, then went still. "Your past is going to find you," he spat. "And when it does, you ain't ready." Elias stared down at him, the threat settling like dust on old wounds. "Maybe so," he said quietly. "But today isn't that day." He tied Harlan's hands and dragged him across the camp, binding him to one of the posts. Mara retrieved her knife, wiping the blade clean as she approached. Lena watched them with trembling hope, her voice faint. "Can we go now?" Elias nodded, lifting her gently. "We're taking you home." The words tasted like a promise and a warning. They saddled the horses quickly, hoisting Harlan onto one like a sack of stones. The basin fell silent again except for the soft crackle of the dying fire. As they rode out, the rising sun cast long, golden beams across the plains. Yet the light did nothing to soften the unease settling in Elias's gut. Harlan's words echoed through him, stirring memories he wished he could silence. Mara noticed his distant gaze, but said nothing for several minutes. Finally, she spoke with quiet certainty. Whatever waits for us ahead, we face it together. Elias met her eyes, finding strength in her unyielding resolve. Together, he agreed. Lena rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing steadying as the horses carried them toward home. The trail ahead glimmered under the sun's growing warmth, but shadows clung stubbornly to its edges. Elias knew the journey was far from over. Harlan had been merely a messenger of a larger storm approaching, a storm built from the past Elias had long feared confronting. But as they pressed onward, the weight of dread felt lighter than before. For the first time in years, Elias understood something simple and profound. Facing the past was easier when you no longer walked alone. The horizon beckoned, bright and vast, holding battles yet to come, and perhaps, if fate allowed, a chance at redemption.